European writers. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
Okay, so to continue our look at modern European writers who have focused on the future in their work, today we're talking about H.G. Wells. Last week, I asked you both to do some background research on Wells, which we're going to discuss now. Geetanjali, tell us about H.G. Wells.
Right. So, H.G. Wells was a hugely successful British science fiction writer, writing at the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th century, and much of his work focused on predicting the future.
Jason, do you think Wells was just using the future as a narrative device in his fiction?
No. He really believed we can predict the future. In fact, he gave a speech at the Royal Institution in London in 1902 called The Discovery of the Future. And the point he was making was that by looking at what you know about the present and about science, it's quite possible to predict the future.
Indeed. Geetanjali, do you think Wells was always optimistic in his predictions?
Not at all. In fact, he varied in his predictions from being extremely pessimistic about the future to being optimistic. Interestingly, one theory I read links the attitude in Wells's work to his own health. When he was writing The Time Machine, which was published in 1895, he'd just been diagnosed with an incurable fatal disease. Not surprisingly, the book is very pessimistic, being about a dystopia in the future, a long time in the future, the year 802-701 in fact, where there are two races on Earth, the Morlocks and the Eloi, and the Morlocks actually eat the Eloi.
I thought it was interesting, though, that it was H.G. Wells who actually came up with the phrase time machine, so despite being pessimistic, the work has had a lasting effect on our culture.
Right. After The Time Machine, though, H.G. Wells didn't die, of course, and his recovery might be why he began to be a bit more optimistic about the future.
So that brings us to his first utopia, Anticipations. Jason, tell us about that.
Well, Anticipations, or to give it its full title, Anticipations of the Reaction of the Mechanical and Scientific Progress upon Human Life and Scientific Thought, was published in 1901 and was set in the New Republic of the year 2000. Some of the things Wells predicts are fairly close to our reality today, including 24-hour news, global telecommunications, and even a European Union.
We'll come back to the accuracy of Wells's predictions a little later. Geetanjali, how was Wells's work received at the time?
Well, although Wells was extremely successful, not everyone respected his work or his predictions. Another well-known science fiction writer, Jules Verne, viciously attacked him for works such as The First Man in the Moon, which Verne argued weren't rooted in scientific fact at all.
That's right. Now, Wells wrote a number of other utopian visions of the future. Jason?
Yes. In A Modern Utopia, published in 1905, his vision was of a world where there's no private property, where everyone has access to wonderful healthcare, and interestingly, where everyone's personal information is stored on cards in a central database outside Paris. Apart from the healthcare, I'm not sure everyone today would see that as a positive view of the future.
Neither am I. And, on a similar note, Wells strongly believed in population control and, in The Shape of Things to Come, which was published in 1933, he sees and supports a world where the population is kept at 2 billion. Once again, I'm not sure most people today would necessarily see that as a good thing.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 7 to 10.
Gitanjali, in your research, did you come across anything about the world brain?
Yes, I did. It's actually very interesting. Throughout the 1930s, Wells predicted and supported the setting up of a huge world encyclopedia. And towards the end of the decade, in 1938, he wrote a series of essays called World Brain. In these essays, he called for the world to make use of modern technology to create an enormous global encyclopedia so that all our knowledge is available to all people, not just an educated elite. Wells envisioned this as probably being on microfilm. He thought it would allow anyone, anywhere in the world, to look at any book or any document. He also thought it would be created by everyone, once again, not just by an elite.
Yes, and as you can imagine, many people today say that the internet has basically fulfilled his prediction. Of course, it doesn't use microfilm, but essentially, it does meet all Wells's main requirements.
That is the end of part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 2. Part 2.
You are going to listen to a conversation between two students about preparing a questionnaire as part of an essay assignment.
First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 14. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 14.
I've never written an essay of more than 1,500 words before, Anne.
Me neither, Mark, and it scares me.
I wouldn't worry. We'll just have to pretend it's 4 essays of 1,500 words and join them together.
It says here in the assignment notes Dr. Brightwell gave us that we're to write between 5,000 and 6,000 words on some aspect of students' attitudes, backed up by our own research, which we present in the form of tables, graphs, charts or whatever, and supported by reference to the list of books she gave us. Oh, I didn't realise there had been so many social science books written about students.
Oh, yeah, there are a lot. And the questionnaire?
Yes, we have to prepare a questionnaire to gather our own data for the graphs, etc., and hand it in to Dr. Brightwell in draft form in 2 weeks' time.
2 weeks?
That's what she said, and what it says here. She says that it's better to have it checked before we go on to collect the information and start the writing.
Suppose she's right. We'd better get started then. But she didn't say how we were going to put the questionnaire together. Does it say anything in the notes?
Nope. It only says that we are limited to 4 sides of A4 and no more than 50 questions.
If that's the case, it's not that bad.
Before you hear the rest of the programme, you have some time to look at questions 15 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 15 to 20.
So, how are we going to do it?
Well, first we need to know who we're aiming it at. Then decide how many questions we're going to ask. I think we could have about 40 questions maximum. I don't think there's any real need to go up to the 50 limit. And I think we should keep the questions themselves very simple.
Don't worry. In my case, they will be.
We could have a mixture of question types, like multiple choice questions, yes, no, and agree, disagree, with boxes for people to tick. If people are asked to write down anything, it's unlikely they will fill it in.
So, are we going to give this questionnaire out to people to hand in, or are we going to just stop and ask them around the campus or on the street?
I don't really know. Did she say anything about this? No, she didn't. And there is nothing in these notes she gave us either.
I think we ought to give them out.
OK.
Anyway, it won't affect the way we design the questionnaire.
We're both doing it on different subjects, but there's nothing wrong with pooling our ideas about the mechanism of the questionnaire.
No, none. What are you doing your project on?
I've been thinking about doing something around the subject of how aware students are of world affairs. People think that we're all up to date, but I very much doubt it. It would also be interesting to compare students in different years. And you?
I'm doing something on health and sport, and whether students are more or less active since they came to university.
Sounds interesting. As the questionnaires can be anonymous, I'll fill in your first questionnaire for you. But I'm sure you won't be surprised by my answers.
Somehow, I don't think so.
I suggest we put together about 20 or 25 questions each and then meet tomorrow or the day after and compare them.
Are you going to type yours up?
Yeah, then I can come round to your place and we can work on them. You've got a laptop, haven't you?
Yes, and I've got some new design software so we can play around with the layout.
Brilliant. Are you any good at doing charts and things?
I know how to do simple things on the computer, but we'll sort something out.
OK.
I feel much better about all this now. It doesn't seem quite as bad as I first thought.
No, don't worry, we'll get it done.
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3. Part 3.
You will hear 2 undergraduates doing a research methods course. A girl called Leela and a boy called Jake having a seminar with their tutor. Now you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24. Now listen and answer questions 21 to 24.
So the task I gave you both was to choose an article about a small-scale research project.
Yes.
You were then required to try to reproduce the research procedures in your own context, i.e. try it out for yourselves.
Yeah, and that's what we've done.
Great. So I'd like you to tell me a bit about the article and why you chose it.
Well, the article's written by 2 university lecturers who had started using crosswords to help their students revise terminology for exams.
And the crosswords were designed and set on computers.
And we selected the article because, well, it seemed an accessible topic, even though we weren't familiar with the technique. You know, using IT to design crosswords for higher education.
That's a good reason. So these lecturers wanted to see how well this innovation was received by their students.
Yes.
So how did you go about reproducing the research?
Well, we drew up a list of terms from one of our own modules and designed a crossword for revising these terms.
Then we asked our classmates to try out the crossword and give us feedback, you know, their opinions on how they felt about using the technique.
Was it easy to find participants?
It wasn't easy at first, but then we convinced them that by taking part in the research, they were actually benefiting themselves by preparing for an exam, which is coming up later this term.
And it worked.
Good. So how did you find out what the students thought about doing the crosswords?
A questionnaire. The original article used a 2-page long questionnaire. There were lots of excellent questions on it, but the whole section on difficulties using IT is now obsolete. Old-fashioned even though it had only been written a couple of years ago.
So you designed a shorter version?
Yeah. Then we sent it to the 40 students by email and got 28 replies. I was taken aback by the fact that everybody we talked to thought this was a good return. I mean, the responses were well written. You know, people had taken a lot of care, but I was really disappointed with the low numbers.
Yes, an important lesson to learn for an apprentice researcher.
Yeah.
Now you have some time to look at questions 25 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 25 to 30.
So what results did you get?
Well, basically, the responses were extremely positive. The students said that doing the crossword on a computer helped them really focus on the work in hand and not be distracted, which is something that commonly happens with other ways of doing revision.
Yeah, that was really clear. But something that struck me was that having fun hardly featured in their responses, nor did anything to do with spelling of hard words, which I thought would be an obvious benefit.
No? Okay.
Respondents also said that doing the crossword hadn't really increased their general motivation to study, but that it had highlighted the gaps in their memory so they knew what further work was necessary.
Right. So how did your findings tally with those of the original researchers?
There were lots of similarities, but...
There were probably 2 main differences. We found that more males than females liked the technique, whereas the original study found the reverse.
Also, our respondents said they wouldn't mind doing a crossword as a final official exam. Whereas in the original study, students said they would hate doing it even if it meant having a shorter test.
But of course, both sets of respondents said they'd be interested in doing more crosswords for informal purposes, revision, and so forth.
Right. So let's have a think about the whole project and what you've learned from doing it.
Well, it was very time-consuming.
Yeah. And I don't think we managed that aspect very well.
It could have been worse. I mean, we didn't have a lot of data, so we didn't have to spend ages processing it. And of course, we'd already done a course on numerical data processing, so there wasn't much new there.
Yeah, that's true. Anyway, I think we designed our questions well so that they gave us manageable data.
Yeah, it really helped having the original study to guide us, as it were. And that helped us to see what a good research instrument is.
What a good questionnaire should be like.
Absolutely. We got a lot from that. But when we were writing up the project, I'm not sure whether we'll know how to acknowledge the work of the original study. You know, our referencing.
No, that's something we'll both have to work on in the future.
Actually, that part's been great. Finding ways to share and support another person.
That's the real plus from the project. Learning ways to do that.
Well, it's obviously been very successful.
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
Part 4. First, you have some time to read the questions.
31 to 36. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 36.
These days, we know a lot about contaminated air, contaminated water, and so on. We know that smoke, chemical substances, and dust particles pollute our environment. We're not so familiar with the concept of pollution from noise, and especially with its psychological effects. Generally, the physical effects are not surprising. Partial or complete deafness can result from excessive noises, airports, some factories, even some discos. But did you know that it's possible to kill a person with the right or wrong noise? Psychologists now believe that noise has a considerable effect on people's attitudes and behavior. Experiments have proved that in noisy situations, even temporary ones, people behave more irritably and less cooperatively. In more permanent noisy situations, many people cannot work hard, and they suffer from severe anxiety and instability, as well as other psychological problems. However, psychologists distinguish between sound and noise. Sound is measured physically in decibels. Noise cannot be measured in the same way because it refers to the psychological effect of sound, and its level of intensity depends on the situation. Thus, for passengers at an airport who expect to hear aeroplanes taking off and landing, there may be a lot of sound, but not much noise. That is, they're not bothered by the noise. By contrast, if you're at a concert and two people behind you are whispering, you feel they're talking noisily, even if there is not much sound. You notice the noise because it affects you psychologically. Both sound and noise can have negative effects. But what is important is if the person has control over the sound. People walking down the street with stereo earphones listening to music that they enjoy are receiving a lot of decibels of sound, but they're probably happy hearing sounds which they control. On the other hand, people in the street without stereo earphones must tolerate a lot of noise which they have no control over. It is noise pollution that we need to control in order to help people live more happily.
Listen to the following talk about man and apes. First, you have some time to look at the questions.
37 to 40. Listen carefully and answer questions 37 to 40.
Man has always been interested in apes because they're at the same time so like him and so unlike him. In their basic anatomy or body structure, they are very similar, and for this reason they are both classified as primates, the highest form of animal. They also resemble each other in having hands and feet instead of claws like cats or hooves like horses. Likewise, neither has a tail. Both men and apes have large brains compared to their body size, and this helps again to distinguish them from other species of animals. But compared to the chimpanzee, for example, man's brain is 4 times as large. Like man, apes can use tools. For example, an ape may pick up a stick and put it in an ant's nest to make the ants come out. Similarly, apes have been known to make tools, for example, by breaking off branches to use as sticks. Man, however, is quite different. In fact, unique among animals because he can make a plan and then make a tool by following that plan. All human beings everywhere have a language, and there are thousands of different languages in the world. All these languages are equally complex, and they are very different from the cries of apes and other animals. Finally, we can use fire-making to differentiate men from apes. Man has possessed the secret of making fire for thousands of years. In contrast, neither apes nor any other animals possess this secret.
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.